Hello, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. Today's episode is a truly wonderful conversation with the writer, designer, educator, Liz Danzico. Liz is currently the creative director at NPR, where she oversees the visual and user experience of NPR's digital products, and she is also the co-founder and chair of SVA's MFA in Interaction Design program. And then she's also written frequently about design, writing, editing for publications like I and Fortune. I first came across Liz's work about a decade ago, actually, through her own site, Bobulate, where I was immediately taken with her writing on everything from creativity to media to journalism to design. And I've been following her work closely ever since. So it was a complete honor to spend time talking with her about her own background and how she thinks about her work, about the intersections of design and writing, and how the two play a role in her various projects. I mean this completely seriously. Liz is one of my absolute favorite people on the internet. She's just so thoughtful, and it's clear that she thinks about these things very deeply. And so I was so happy to get to talk to her, and am excited to share this conversation with you. So here is Liz Danzico on Scratching the Surface. You know, I'll be honest, I was thinking about this conversation and the things I wanted to talk to you about the last couple days, and you do so many different interesting things, and I was struggling of how to structure this conversation.
I know, I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. And I was thinking I came to your work first through Bobulate, and so I think of you first as a writer, and I feel like some of that is a bit of a disservice to what you do because there's so many other things. And so I kind of wanted to start with, how do you, when you introduce yourself or when you're at a party, what do you say you do?
Well, I feel like it's it's a little bit like asking somebody where they're from.
Yeah.
Because I mean, your work is your place anyway. And so, if I live in New York and you're in New York, it's like what you talk about is like which neighborhood you live in. But if I'm in, India, mm-hmm. I talk about being from the United States. So it's a bit like that. And depending on who I talk to in levels of familiarity, I mean, when I'm talking to someone like you, although there's probably no other person like you, when I'm talking about someone who's familiar with all the aspects of the things, it's easy to say, well, and I can give you examples of what I say. I do this, 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 and this, and there's lots of commas and ands.
Right.
But when I'm talking to someone sort of not knowing where they're coming from, I generally say I'm in the field of design. I say either I'm a designer or I'm in design, because I mean that in the broadest sense. And talking about media and journalism also gives it context. Mm-hmm. And for quite a long time, I've been in either, strictly in journalism and media or publishing. So there's always been this kind of media aspect to it. So that gives people's eyes start coming into focus when I start making it, a bit more specific.
So how did you kind of get into those areas? Where did your interest in design, writing, journalism, media, where'd that come from?
Yeah, I should sort of add a footnote to what I said, which is I say design and designer, but I'm totally lying because I actually don't feel like I'm qualified to say that today still. And maybe someday. I also, after living in New York for 20 years, don't really feel qualified to say I'm a New Yorker. So maybe those two things are related.
Oh, interesting.
Somehow. So we should talk about what it means to be qualified for something. But it's a good question. I mean, I think that I was trained as a writer, so I came at all these things through the lens of language and words. And as I was going through, I think I was in college, I was still, probably a junior or so in college. And I've always been interested in sort of three fields, if you will. One is writing, one is education, and one is design. I don't think I had writing seemed pretty straightforward, although there was lots of facets to that as well. But the other two felt so obtuse, to me, so inaccessible. And I found myself as a junior in college. I went to Penn State University, and I found myself doing an internship for the Center for Learning and Teaching. So it was the center that actually taught the faculty at Penn State how to be better teachers. And my job was to write stories and then, without using these words, design, do the information design for the stories, so lay them out. And essentially do editorial design for their newsletter. So they threw me in a room with PageMaker and like a blank sheet of paper, because that was the tool that one used
and
at that time.
You had never done anything like that before?
I was like, where do images come from? I mean, I had no idea, no principles of type size or layout, nothing. But I was riveted. I mean, I remember specifically this moment. It was just like so adolescent to say at this point. But frankly, I still feel like this sometimes, where it's like, you realize that the power of not just the language itself or the way that it is expressed, but the combination of the two of them, right? Which is kind of like the art of creating an argument. It's the field of rhetoric. It's like how this is expressed is the very thing that gets people engaged with it. It was like, no one's ever said that to me. I didn't even know what that meant. And so anyway, so from that point, I was like, I have to figure this out. So at that point, I did a whole bunch of things in between. I actually left school after I graduated and became an English teacher, and I kind of traveled the world for a couple of years, sort of thing. And while I was studying for my GREs, and I was determined to find a graduate school that would teach me about the intersection between language and design, as I talked about it then. Where you described it really nicely, and today I feel like we have many more frameworks for this, or sort of phrases and language to talk about this. But then it was like, where's the intersection between writing and design? Is there such a thing? What is it called? And so that's what I was really after, and sort of biding my time, teaching English and, roaming around the world, seeing things. And ended up in a graduate program at Carnegie Mellon, where this writing degree was situated within the studio from the design students. So they sort of mixed design students and writing students together. And the rest is history. It was like, here it is. Like, I'm in the geographic intersection of writing and design. I'm taking classes, everything from, how to write, style, advanced grammar, management courses, HCI courses, communication design courses, to actual sort of like, I took my first interaction design studio then, and things like that. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the early days. Those are like, if you ask me, like, where was, I'm sure there was much, I was not carving letter forms in my bed above my head per se. I can't trace my interest back to, like early childhood, but I remember specifically like those moments where I felt like I wanted to pursue the intersections, not the middles.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. As a kid, did you want to be a writer before college? Was writing part of your childhood?
It was. I mean, I actually was absolutely 100% convinced I was going to be like a zoologist or a veterinarian or, something completely unrelated. But by the time I was, in high school, I remember my mom and I talking a lot about library science. And sort of like the organization of literature and words, right?
Yeah.
And then I remember writing my college application essays on words and their forms and their sounds, right? And so it wasn't writing that I loved as much as the power of language, from almost like getting into the nerdiness of linguistics and rhetoric and, human behavior. So like how language actually has that impact.
Yeah.
And so I actually, being the sort of uninformed, and I don't mean this as a slight, I don't know what I was going to say, uninformed. I thought that was going to take the form of being a person in advertising, because those are the role models I saw.
Yeah.
That's where I thought you did that.
Yeah.
And I've never done that, so I never went that direction. But those were my earliest thoughts, if any at all. But I was totally going to work for National Geographic or,
interesting.
I was on the animal track.
That's so interesting. The reason I asked that last question, though, is because it's interesting that in college, as you were writing, you were also designing right at the same time. So right at the beginning, you were doing both of these things together. Were you thinking about, as you were writing, were you thinking about the design or the visual side of it, or vice versa, as you were working on those things?
I tell you, and I think back, I've just recently moved and I found, like my portfolio for whatever it was.
Yeah.
I had no business creating a portfolio at all. So like it was such an amateur thing, and it reminded me that writing came naturally and design did not, but I was so much more fascinated. And so that's how it felt anyway. Like design was so interesting and hard, if one can even separate design and writing, which is another story. But
right.
The words came naturally, and then the communication of those words seemed it seemed deeply intriguing, I guess. And so I ended up spending a lot more time on that aspect of it. So I thought about it in that way. I was very conscious of like, wow, I just sort of spent, a day and a half thinking about the presentation of this one thing.
Right.
When to, come up with the idea, and the communication of that idea in text form seems really natural. So that was always interesting to me. Like, why is it, what does that mean? And I spent a long time thinking, well, I'm probably not qualified to be a designer, because otherwise that would just come naturally to me.
Yeah.
And I would have those visual instincts, and maybe the writing was more difficult.
It's weird, because I feel like I'm the opposite, where design has always come very natural to me, and I was the kid that was, looking at typography as like a elementary school kid and asking my parents why letter forms look different depending on what sign they were on. But I was always fascinated by writing, and that was the harder thing for me to understand how that works. So it's almost the exact opposite, which is actually kind of funny.
Yeah. And so here's a question for you.
Okay.
When people ask you what you do, and you're at the intersection of these two, what do you say?
95% of the time will say I'm a designer and just leave it at that. And then if they ask more questions, I'll go into it. It's exactly what you said. Depending on the situation and who I'm talking to, I will occasionally say I'm a designer and a writer. But more often than not, I just leave it at designer. And because the writing that I do is either related to my design work or it's about design. So like you said, I see them often as one and the same.
Yeah, I remember I had my first, I think it was my first, no, it was one of my first interviews while I was still in graduate school for like my real job, right? What I perceived to be like my first real job, and I had a lot of cool jobs before that, but this was like the thing that I was qualified to do now legitimately with a master's degree. And I was on the phone with a creative director in New York City who was like my second or my third interview.
Okay.
And I remember standing in my Pittsburgh apartment where I was looking when he said to me, "So it looks like you're a writer, but you're applying for this design position. What's the difference between those two? How do they intersect?" And it was like being called out as a fraud, right? Yeah. It was like, oh no, he's right. But what I said, and which I very much believe, was something to the effect of, I really don't think that there's you can separate those two. In the work that I like to do, you're thinking about the two together, whether they're coming from one person or you're, collaborating with someone. And so, yes, you're right. Those two were in a much the same. And I thought for sure he was like going to hang up the phone. I thought he was just going to say like, "No, so bad fit, like wrong. We have designers over here, we have writers over here." But he ended up getting hired somehow, and he never brought it up. I'm sure this was not an important moment in his life at all.
Right.
But it's always it felt like a small victory to me. It was like this pursuit, this instinct that I had that we could exist and coexist together. Was okay. It was like allowed in the world. And I moved to New York to pursue that and have never left.
I over the summer I interviewed Michael Rock from 2x4, and he's somebody who also kind of sees them as the same thing. And he said something really interesting when I talked to him. He said that he sees design as an elaborate form of writing was the phrase he used. And I just love that so much, and I think I've probably repeated it to everybody that I've interviewed since. But I'm curious, could you just kind of elaborate a little bit more on those connections that you see between the two, or the process, how they overlap, and how you can't disconnect them?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I do think that I love that too, and I will now use it as well.
That's great.
I do feel like, to bring up another quote, the E.L. Doctor quote about, writing is like driving with your at night with no headlights, kind of. So I feel like it's that process, and how they're connected is almost a surprise every time,
right?
Such that you have to stumble on it in order to know how they connect, which makes it very hard in a large team or a large organization where everybody has like a discrete role. Then you have to do things like plan out when the moments where design can happen, or plan out the language, is over here in this document. So I think it becomes harder when you're in a, sort of a larger, more, kind of organized environment. But in the best of senses, I think the process it's like I'm trying to think of a metaphor where, one supplements the other. Like one inspires the other. So if the inspiration is coming from a place that feels textual, then you might start there. And supplement and kind of like move it forward in a kind of Katamari like snowball effect with design. It builds upon itself. But if the inspiration is visual, you start with any number of things, colors or shapes, right? And then the words are serving that. And I think that's the thing. They sort of like, one, for me anyway, sometimes, the one serves the other, and one at least begins as dominant, and sometimes it changes. But I think for me, most of the time, it's starting with language, and very rarely does it start with images, unless I'm sort of like grabbing things that are inspiring and just kind of putting them as.
Yeah, I have two questions related to that. The first one is how. Let me think the best way to phrase this. How do you think your background in writing makes you a better designer, and then vice versa, your background as a writer helps in your design process?
I believe that this is something that is completely individual. So it's not something that I would say, this is a way that other people can be. For me, I think through writing in general. And that's not just when it comes to things that, are in the field of design or professional. I mean, in my personal life, and there's writing all over this table where I'm sitting, everywhere. And for me, writing makes things real. And so It's like I think there's a sort of like feeling in the sort of zeitgeist now that putting it on social media makes it real, right? And
Right.
so it's that kind of feeling for me where if I don't write it, I don't know what I think about it. And so so to answer your question about how that background informs the design process, I do find it helpful, and I find myself writing about the design in a number of ways. I think helpfully now, I think we're communicating a lot on things like Slack and different kinds of messaging systems, and of course email and presentations. And so part of my job today is very much about writing about design.
Right.
Even with the context of my work.
Yeah.
So it very much helps. So that is, I think, how that process has helped the design, my design methodology. I don't know if it's a chicken or an egg sort of thing. I don't know if because I have training in writing, I think that way, or because I think that way, I went and got training in writing. But in any case, that's the state of things. And I think in the other direction, I mean, just finding that this is centuries of learning about how the art of presentation truly affects how people hear and understand, and learning more deeply about that from specific colors that make people feel things to what's legible and what's readable at certain sizes. These things all help, but I think the overarching concept is so powerful, and it's true not only for beautiful objects that we receive, but also a text message, and how it's punctuated or not. The sort of presentation of our words is it's inextricable. So that's the way I think about those.
I really like that. I like that a lot. You actually started answering the second part of my question, was how do those kind of hybrid backgrounds influence how you think about the work that you're doing now at NPR or at SVA? Like at a very kind of practical level, how do those things come together for you?
At SVA, I think the connection's a little easier, or in teaching in general, because it's a program that I had the honor of, designing.
Right.
And so I have not complete authority, but I have a bit more authority in the organization on this in terms of the field of interaction design. And one of the things that I found when I was researching the program before it even started is that one of the weaknesses of design students, as you probably very well know, and this is an average, not a specific school or design students in general, but they don't have a strength in writing or in presenting their work, right? So the articulation of their work is not something that they probably are strong at it, but we just don't focus on it too much. I think that's changed over the course of several years, actually, in the United States anyway. However, we place a significant emphasis on writing in the program. And presentation, but that's sort of a slightly separate topic. But because of that lack that's there, we make a point of helping people with telling their stories, and that's not just the ideas that they're pitching, but the specific work that they're doing and the careers that they see themselves taking on. So I think that's how it works at SVA, and I'm really, it makes me so happy. I was just speaking with two faculty members at the end of the day yesterday about a survey they did with our alumni, and the provocation was something like, tell us how writing has influenced your life after you've graduated. How have the practices you've learned in a graduate program extended beyond graduation and changed a moment in your life? And the stories they showed me are just incredible. How they've continued the practice of, either blogging or writing, and hear specific examples of how it's changed their life. So that's
that's
just
great.
so satisfying.
Yeah.
Now at NPR, it's interesting. You asked that question in the beginning about how I describe myself, and I think it's wonderful to hear. I do think that there's a large group of people, primarily in the digital space, who knew me from my writing on my blog, who do think of me as a writer.
Yeah.
And I still do all kinds of writing, but not my role at NPR at all.
Oh, interesting.
NPR has incredible trained journalists, reporters, writers, editors that are, and my job is in design. And while those two things work together, I don't think anyone has ever, mistaken me for a writer, or probably really even knows that I have a secret life as a writer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's not something that comes up. That said, we have,
That's so interesting.
we have lots of conversations. Yeah, it's interesting. You have to sort of know where your value lies. So, right, I am only a designer, but design is broad, and I'm very involved in all kinds of things, which we can talk about if it's interesting, but very much in the design sort of side of things, if you will. Although I do a lot of kind of like teaching and helping shape strategy and organizational change and those kinds of things, as you would at any large organization. But yeah, so I think it comes up mainly in the ways that I described, which is like presenting design or communicating design, speaking with the designers, and but not explicitly, only storytelling in the kind of product experience sense.
Okay.
Kind of telling the story of how you're going to experience this new thing. Now, I will say that an interesting area that we have been working in for, I'm going to say a year, but it might be a little bit more, a little bit less, is voice commands. With the increasing, not to get really tech and geeky but sort of related, where it's all kind of colliding or overlapping at this point, where we're developing products that sit in your home, or we are part of the application interface of the products that sit in your home, where you can speak to the product and it will play NPR. And so people on our team are doing research, not just on, kind of delivering that to you, but also like, what are the correct phrases? And what does one say when you want to get the news or be caught up on the news, or, is it the news or is it NPR? And what about your member station? And so there's lots of interesting, kind of very tactical, but powerful language choices that we're making as designers and with the rest of the digital team that very much affect your experience. And I believe it's like truly the integration of writing and design, where neither one is even visible, right? It's all now in the environment, physical space.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. Actually, a friend of mine just got an Amazon Echo and said that when he says, "What's the news?" it's NPR that plays. I didn't even think of that. I want to talk a little bit about design criticism, and I don't mean to go too far back in history, but I interviewed Khoi Vinh a couple months ago also, and I had completely forgotten that the two of you did for a short time a site called A Brief Message, which was a site that I read when I was I was probably late high school, early college.
Wow.
And that was one of the, design criticism sites that I read.
Oh man, that was fun. And Steve Heller was one of our interviewees. He was one of our writers. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm curious about, what is your, in addition to A Brief Message, which was, that was probably like 10 years ago now.
I think it was 2007. Yeah.
what is your relationship to design criticism, or do you have any, aside from kind of publishing like that, do you have any involvement in that? Or have
Yeah,
you ever?
it's a good question. Well, the definition of design criticism is also kind of, blurry, if you will.
Yeah.
It's yes and no. I don't do anything right now like a brief message, but just yesterday, and I haven't thought about it in at least a couple of years since our last, reader. Occasionally we get like a past reader who's like, your site is down. It would be nice to see it again.
Yeah.
But I just looked at Google Analytics yesterday for something else and noticed we still had it connected, and haven't looked at it in 10 years.
Oh, wow.
So I haven't done anything like that since that I'm aware of. But, I guess I jump at the opportunity to participate in anything that resembles projects like that, whether they be about, testing the boundaries of, art direction and editorial, or constraints and, kind of textual constraints and visuals. I just participated in a book that was published in the fall as one of the 3 editors, and it's on, it's called LEAP, Career Pathways and Social Innovation, and it's about career pathways that one could take in social innovation, told through 82 different designers. Designers, again, architects, urban planners, linguists, civic tech folks, all kinds of people. And it's an absolutely stunning object as well. It's just this beautiful book. And the stories are organized into 4 different sections. And I would say that it is absolutely an interpretation. It is a piece of design criticism in that we're looking at these 3 almost like critical lenses of this work. One is, how does it happen? Where does it happen? What's it happen? Why does it happen? And each of us wrote a kind of introduction, and then we curated the stories that are the interviews, the case studies within, and then illustrated each of them with language, images, and color. And so I guess that's the most recent thing that was sort of public that I was involved with. And I do, at any given time, I think there's, I don't know, a dozen of those projects kind of floating around for me.
What's the, I hate to use this word, but I can't think of a better one, but what is the value that you see in producing work that is kind of, quote unquote, design criticism, that's looking at the profession, looking at practice, looking at the work that is in the world, and kind of figuring out what it means?
It's a good question. I feel like if you had asked me that 10 years ago, I would say, and not unrelated to a brief message, but thinking about it from like almost an AIGA standpoint, which is, it is our responsibility. Sounds very big, but we'll say it, responsibility to to document the state of design and to be reflective and to look back and to think about, the underpinnings of the work that we do now. Perhaps it suggests something about where we're going, but to give it shape, to create nomenclature that we can talk about it and point to it and recognize it. And I do think that that's true. And particularly even, around that time, we had like the death of ID magazine and, the sort of things where it was kind of like, well, who's keeping track now, right? Like what, and where, and the question still stands, like, where is the center of gravity for design criticism? But I think now I still think that there is that same value, which is giving us shape, giving us shapes to point at and language to use to talk about it with each other, so that it's clear where the clusters are and what the patterns are, what the trends are, what, give us something to work with. And everything is, things are shifting so quickly.
Right.
That I feel like it used to be like, let's look at the year 2001. And, it's like there was the .com, it was the economy, and you could sort of describe it in a general term, and things are just,
right.
What the hell is going on? I mean, I think we document something today, and I was just looking, in fact, the thing I was doing right before we talked was looking at the most exciting emerging technologies in 2017 and trying to write about them for something we're working on. And I sort of looked back at the most exciting emerging technologies of 2016, and it's just, it's uncontainable.
Yeah.
So I guess that is the value now, which is really to help mark moments in time and almost do like a, visualization, whether it's in text or visuals, like just to sort of make sense of the present. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Right. Do you think what I have a couple different questions based on you got a lot of different things going that I want to think about now. Let me think exactly how to organize this for a second. What do you think are the topics or the issues or the events that are facing designers, in 2017 that should be talked about critically?
Yeah. I've been talking a lot about the ethics of design and the responsibilities of designers, and who knows who can teach us that. And I think, so for example, we teach a class here at SVA that is called urban fiction, but I feel like it's design ethics in that, students, as one part of what they do is they use open path data that the data trails that we're leaving with our phones, and they sort of spy on one another using these data trails, and then they visualize it. And and of course it's opt-in and people get permission to do so. But it brings up all these interesting questions about, were we able to do such things, for clients or in public and outside of school? Where is the line between cool and creepy? Right. Where's the line between, private and public? Where's the line between, danger and safety? Or, and so we have, a class, and we explore those. We certainly don't come to any conclusions, but I think it's really important for designers to be thinking about those boundaries, lack thereof, where, and creating them. I think the other, we come up with all these questions about autonomous vehicles and responsibility and ethics, and I think the same things are coming up with the home products.
Right.
There was a story of can the police subpoena I can't remember if it was an Echo or what it was. But, as we're designing these things, I mean, of course, our deliverable might only be the voice command, or it might be the hardware, or it might be the, object itself, the logo, who knows. But as designers, I feel like we can know, not that we ever did, but more and more it is absolutely our responsibility to consider the entirety of the thing that we're participating in. And those ethical questions that I just mentioned, I think are really important for us. So that's one thing.
Yeah. That's
one whole thing. That's sort of like an overlay across lots of the things that we're thinking about, products and services. Then, my focus is in product, like tech. But the other kinds of things are just kind of, I don't know, human/robot kind of think about, we were talking about conversational interfaces and bots and all those fun things that everybody's so excited about last year. And just, thinking about how do we maintain the human aspect of design, and to make sure that while it is phenomenal to be excited by those things and to wholly participate and to prototype and explore and get familiar with like where the boundaries are so that we can like go beyond them.
Yeah.
How do we remember that, you know, we're humans talking to one another, and to keep those experiences grounded in kind of the human experience? So
yeah, you know,
those are giant things that I'm thinking about.
But, I mean, it's such a good answer though, and it actually set up the next question that I was going to have for you. And it's a change that I've noticed in myself as I've been doing these interviews and as I've been kind of working on this whole project. Is I started with this kind of idea that, you know, design criticism is important, and we need to have a richer, deeper dialogue around design, graphic design specifically, interaction design, product design. And my kind of loose feeling of that was that we had to go more than talking about, you know, typefaces and color choices and, you know, company X's logo is better than the old logo that they had. And as I've been talking to people, I've realized that, well, I've been kind of using architecture and film criticism as my model. Yep. And as I've been talking to people, I've noticed shifting to using technology and media criticism is actually in many ways a better comparison in how we should talk about design and in the way that it affects people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely fair. I mean, I think that you see, well, anyway, in any case, from my small window, I see a lot of architects trying to understand how to think about interaction design to better inform the work that they're doing. That's, of course, a broad sweeping statement, but just, you know, anecdotally, I'm seeing that just with architects who come to the interaction design program. And yeah, I think that's a fascinating question to explore. Like we could take another hour to look at. No, you know, because like how I think, you know, the way that, or the impact, I don't know if it's about the history of the field or the impact that field makes, or who has access to the tools and the, you know, the things that field sort of needs to propel itself, or, you know, why is that? But that's super interesting. And I bet that's true. I mean, I think media and technology, they, you know, have been for 20 years saying digital media. Yeah. It's all related.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what does that mean?
That's what I'm trying to figure. Yeah, that's what I'm talking to you for. Good. I have just a couple quick questions just to start to wrap it up a little bit. And I wanted to kind of tie it all the way back to the beginning of that connection between design and writing. But, you know, what do you see as the future of, or not the future, but a future or a possible future of how design writing or design criticism could manifest itself, you know, beyond text on a blog or in a magazine or something like that?
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's an interesting idea to consider. Tell you, so I think about this a lot. I don't think about that question a lot, and so thank you for catching me off guard. But I do think about the oral tradition a lot. You know, oral histories, which is how stories got told before there's certainly no Twitter, but that we couldn't even write. Right? It's sort of like if there is such a thing as pre-written society, pre-literate society, this is how people tell stories. And sometimes I feel like, do you ever have those moments where you feel like you're glimpsing the future a little bit? You're like, I can see this all unfold. Like when you're going through airport security, you're like, it's definitely not going to be like this in 5 years. This is like, I feel like I'm living in the past. And sometimes when we're communicating, like, you know, texting and sending images, and certainly like, oh, I wish I had my phone so I can take a photo of. Sometimes I feel like we're returning inevitably to this place where we're post-literate, you know, society, where instead of capturing everything, we're capturing nothing, and holding everything in our heads as a song that we perform to the audiences wherever they are, because that's how it used to work, right? The epic poems were songs that people went from village to village and performed in order to remember them based on how the audience was reacting. So I think that that's an extreme version to say we're not going to write anything down, but you see our devices get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Technology becomes more and more and more invisible. And we are relying on this kind of impromptu, improvisational way of storytelling that's very much designed for and measures how people react, right? I got 2,300 hearts and clicks and whatever. So it's a bit of that, right? And so I can imagine once this technology completely dissipates into the background, we don't see any of it. Right. And maybe we just lose it altogether. It becomes embedded and whatnot. But what does design criticism become when it's an improvised, audience-driven record?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're going.
Yeah. Wow. I love that.
You asked. That's my sci-fi future answer. But obviously I'm being a bit dramatic about it. But I think that the kernels of what the sort of tenets of what I'm trying to say are, I do think it's going to be a bit more responsive and a bit more integrated into everyday life rather than sort of this separate, record or archive, but much more integrated to our everyday experience.
I love that. I thought that was great. I think that's a perfect way to end this also. And I just want to thank you for having this conversation. And Bobulate is in my must reads of my RSS read. And every time there's a new one, I get excited. And you're one of my, I really mean this, you're one of my favorite people on the internet. And I thought this was a really great and interesting conversation. So thank you so much.
Oh, of course. Thank you for asking so many interesting questions.
This episode was recorded on January 20th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.